people waiting for float revenue. And she moves the camera to the front of the arm, frames it, and produces this. An image that was instantly reproduced. Life magazine just took one look at this and bang! It's even taken up by Goebbels in Berlin, who used it for German propaganda too, saying, see, America has its problems, it's not just. This is an absolutely brilliant. Now, look at that. Instead of a single scene, we're given two. They meet in a conceptual space, right, in which they form a coordinated double image by their oppositions. The two scenes are sharply reduced to the relevant items, framing has achieved this. Characterized by their opposite actions, absolutely. And from this symmetrical display of two rarefied plots, simplified, that is to say, derives the verdict. That is to say, this remarkable contrast between this poster issued by the National Association of Manufacturers trying to boost American production in 1937, when there was like a second depression, actually. It's a very bad year, 37, because Roosevelt had very foolishly tried to balance the budget when he got re-elected in 36, and it produced a temporary low back into the depression. So, wonderful picture here. Political. This is exactly the same. The structure is identical. Now, that's what I'm trying to insist upon. But the visual can argue. Here it is. And there is a politics here. Some of you probably aren't old enough to remember that post on the right. You looked so young then. I used it a few years ago because I think I'm the only person who never ever bought hope. The difference between, we can see it politically, between the charismatic image, the erratic image, that which entices your emotions but stops your brain thinking, and which also closes things down. And the opposite, the work of dissent, where again, structuring. And I found this one of the most poignant anti-war political posters in the last 10 or 20 years. Whereby the insertion of the text names what Badiou would call a gap or a void in the comprehension of things. There's something missing that we have to supply. Badiou says it speaks to, we have something where it speaks to the existing situation, but by virtue of the distance it places, in this case in the image, it launches thought beyond the limits and rules of that situation. That's configuration, that's reconfiguration, that's visual structuring, that's argument. And you can see it again in this very famous poster from the anti-Vietnam War campaigns. Early 70s, became one of the iconic famous photos. About 1972, I think, around that time. So, we're thinking now about critique and structure. Keep some of that in mind because we look at this, and let's move and try to think about some of the questions about critique and the question about the design profession. And as I said, I gave you some of Jan van Toorn's critique of this in the little paper I wrote about the critical in design, appearing 2 papers by him in these 2 books when he worked at the Jan van Eyck Academy. And these are the essays of the critique of the process whereby design has become a branch of industry. Towards very, and has thus learned, as he puts it, to place uncritical affirmation of what is at the centre of its world, rather than, for example, as he puts it, offering what modernism initially promised, the anticipation of a realizable future possibility that was not dependent on a particular economic schema. Toorn makes 4 points. Of course, you would have to do. One, the failure of design's Faustian bargain with market forces, which has its other side in the surrender of design to economic interests. 3, the failure of design to reflect on the conditions and capacities of its own practice. And 4thly, the consequent inability by designers to understand their own practices. You could see it relates into 2 big sectors, really. How design relates to the economy and how design fails to understand itself, how it fails to understand its own mind. Let me just read you a couple of the points that Jan van Toorn makes, because I took them out of the lecture to try and save time, but I would like to make them. He says, in respect to the first one, the failure Faustian bargain, Van Toorn says that design, for all its accommodation to the status quo, which has given it, he says, massive status, money, income, the design profession has boomed in the last 50, 60 years. For all its attempted accommodation with these interests, it has become little more than a handmaiden to market concerns, a theatrical substitute for missing essential forms of social communication, while at worst drawing on roles in organisation and production and in helping to stimulate consumption. It is economically at one with the intensifying creation of a fundamentally unsustainable world, a role it's incapable of acknowledging with any honesty. Its most far-reaching consequence, he says, is undoubtedly a political neutralisation which is at odds with the functioning of an open and democratic political system. Savage comment here by Jan van Toorn. And he said this ideological accommodation is kind of a surrender to institutions, expressed in a lack of interest in insight into the social role of the profession. Not questioning social responsibilities implies you surrender to that sector of society. Design, often regarded as an autonomous activity, thereby functions more and more as an aesthetic legitimation of the dominant ideology. He said, this isn't given by nature or anything, it's given actually through this failure to reflect critically upon the conditions under which their own action comes about. As a result, he says, designers' mediating role between private and public interest has been lost. Deprived of critical insight, what is missing insight, design loses sight of its own work. Since designers lack necessary concepts and arguments, they found themselves incapable of renegotiating an attitude which is beneficial to all. Design becomes blind to itself, loses understanding of its own capabilities. No surprise, and he finishes up, this results in a growing lack of belief within the design professions as to the makeability, the changeableness of the socio-cultural and economic conditions. It's a pretty savage indictment. Dunn, in effect, Tony, as I gave you in your reading, in effect takes up Jan van Toorn in his PhD thesis. And Dunn's book entails as an interesting example of how Dunn used his theoretical reflections in his PhD on how to become critical in relationship to electronic products as the basis of all of his future kind of creative practice. Not surprisingly, Tony Dunn also makes 4 key points. You can describe these 4 as design not engaged in the essential issues which concern electronic products. Design does not understand its potential roles vis-a-vis the design and conception of new products. The marketplace allows little or no space for speculation, and the limited role of designers in electronic product development. In other words, what really Dunn is saying, if you like, is 1 and 3 are basically, in a sense, the market curtailing imagination even before imagination starts. And 2 and 4 are kind of both partly the market, partly design itself. Again, sort of curtailing the conception of the product, not necessarily the detail. We're actually talking about design in a sense. We could simplify all this and say design being confined to the downstream aspect, the very last moment of designing something, rather than being brought into the conception. But Dunn says this is not just, as it were, the fault of bad industry, it's the fault of the designers who have not got themselves in there. And Dunn says at the very start of that book, where he republishes it in 2005, which was originally his PhD thesis, drafted about 1995, he said, since I wrote my PhD, he said, lots has changed in the world of electronic products, been extraordinary, 10, 15 years, he says, but very little has changed in the world of the design. Electronic technologies are still largely dealt with on a purely aesthetic level. There are some exceptions, of course, he says, but something is missing. Design is not engaging with the social, cultural, and ethical implications of the technologies it makes so sexy and consumable. It seems not yet to have fully understood how it can help relocating the electronic product beyond a culture of relentless innovation for its own sake to a broader context of critical thinking about its role in everyday life, or how design can be used as a critical medium for reflecting on the cultural, social, and ethical implication of technology. That is a quite powerful kind of role, I think, a powerful sort of indictment. So Dunn is pointing to the fact that something is missing. It's not engaging with what is essential. Design isn't understanding how it can help to relocate the product. It doesn't understand about being a critical medium for reflecting on technology. And design is essentially outside the sphere of how products are conceived and thought. Its role in development is totally peripheral. What is missing in Dunn's view is the critical perspective. It is somehow, and he says, look, he's aware of the difficulties here. Industrial design is not art, neither is it purely a business tool. Somehow he's basically saying we have to sort of find ways of negotiating things. It's not a question of actually oscillating. Well, how do we negotiate? How do we kind of move in between these two? How can critical responses to the ideological nature of the design inform the development of aesthetic possibilities for electronic products? And aesthetic here is used in a very wide sense, really the behavioral possibilities. Dunn himself puts forward a very active critical program proposing an approach, this is his whole idea, of conceptual electronic products as a way of provoking complex and meaningful reflection, depth reflection, on the ubiquitous, dematerializing, and intelligent artificial environment we have. So this is widening it out. This is the product now being able to reflect upon the artificial. And he insists that this program can be enacted through design, that design can be used as a critical. For example, he says, and this is from the 1990s when he was first developing these ideas, he talks about going beyond optimization to explore critical roles, using estrangement as a way to open the space of discussion and criticism, designing alternative functions to draw attention to legal, cultural, and social roles, exploiting the unique narrative possibilities employed by electronic products. These are just first suggestions, but they indicate a kind of concrete possibility within that. Now note here, this is very important, that Dunn's argument is not for criticism for its own sake. It's an argument for the necessity of the critical stance in relation to our engagement with these products, which now largely constitute our world. And it's an argument about the possibilities of design as a vehicle for reflecting on the roles of the electronic product in everyday life, and more generally, the cultural, social, and ethical impact of technology. So how do we begin to recover or free the critical design? Again, this could be an entire lecture in itself. I'm going to simplify this and then move fairly directly to the example. One, we really have to begin to see the critical as internal to design. That one of the peculiar things that's happened is that the critical is internal. You cannot design without having a criticism of what is. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother. By definition, design has a critical moment. So therefore, that's in its structure, it's in its DNA in a way. And it's extraordinary how much that has been repressed. Secondly, recovering the capacities and capabilities of design, its true capacities and capabilities. And I think this is very important because designers have this, or design, I should say, has this tendency to both overvalue itself rhetorically. You often find this statement now, design is everything. It's about the stupidest statement that you could possibly make, while underselling itself and offering a supine position on the other. The only way to get out of that crazy and unhelpful oscillation is to actually try to work out what are the capacities and capabilities. Thirdly, to see design situations as ontological. That is to say, to be situations of persons, things, and environments. Taking a view on a situation, any situation, involves ethical apprehension. So perceptions about design possibility are never merely formal, they're ontological. They address the conditions of lives, and they're therefore political. Design here, we could say, as I said last week, addresses the singularity of situations, and the ethical edict to the situation is very simple but here. Treat it to the limit of the possible. Draw from the situation to the greatest possible extent the affirmative humanity that it contains. There we are. That's the only ethics we need for design. The only ethics we need. We don't need any more. Once you can work with that, right. And overarching the previous three, there must be also some kind of relativizing, bracketing of the economic, some putting at a distance the tyranny of pure economic demand. So those are the four. Now let's move into visual case studies. And one is an architect, Luis Barragan, in Mexico City, who is about as far from a revolutionary as you could possibly be. He's deeply conservative, deeply Catholic, aristocratic Mexican. Architect, but I want to put architect in inverted commas, but I want to show you why I think Barragan is interesting to look at. Some background on Barragan. He was born about 1902, I think, in Guadalajara. Came from a ranching family which very much traced itself back to sort of Spanish aristocracy, real or mythical, doesn't really matter, but that was kind of in the family kind of attitude, so a sort of very much a sort of aristocratic attitude. He studied architectural engineering in Guadalajara at the university. I don't think he ever took an architectural degree or even actually got his degree in architectural engineering. He built one or two houses, somewhat conventional houses in Guadalajara in his early 20s, before embarking on a long tour of Europe in the 20s, where he saw the Art Deco exhibition in Paris in 1925, saw some of Le Corbusier's villas, also saw houses in Andalusia in Spain, the sort of Moorish houses which he sort of identified with in terms of his family background, and also the gardens of a Mediterranean, of a sort of quite fantastic architect called Labac, who was a sort of fantasist garden designer who Barragan got fascinated with. So these don't quite fit together. He comes back and he moves to Mexico City in the 30s, partly because he is gay. Guadalajara is just too conservative. He moves to Mexico City and he starts to build, this is Mexico City's in a boom in the 30s, small houses for clients and apartment buildings for speculation. He does a massive work. I'm sorry about the quality of this slide, but you can see, but actually since the buildings are absolutely awful, it really doesn't matter if you're not looking at them. The interesting thing is exactly this. Barragan does a whole mass, and most of them seem somehow to be extant. And in 1940, he looks at what he's done, and he decides that he loathes it, hates it. And this is where it is interesting. If he died in 1940, age 38, we would never look at Barragan. We would never look at these buildings again. The only reason why you could go and find them in Mexico City now is because Barragan did them. What Barragan looked at in his own work what he became dissatisfied with. He says basically words to the effect of, I am sort of designing buildings, but I am not designing sites for dwelling. That's the gist of what he says. Now, the interesting thing is then what he does. Because he could do several things then. He could continue being an architect. He could take his architecture away from purely financial speculation, which all these were, into, say, a more social route. He doesn't do that. He could try to sort of transform his architectural career. He could turn backwards from modernism, which might be very logical, because he's saying that the modern architecture that he's creating here does not fit with how we live and how we dwell in Mexico. He could turn back to sort of a Mexican culturalism. He could turn back to becoming a fine artist. He can continual aspirations to be an artist. He doesn't do any of these things. He does something different. He builds gardens. He buys plots of land and he builds gardens. Builds because these are quite built at scale. These are not just pottering in your garden. These are built at scale. And then he sells them off as building plots. It's like a long 4 or 5 years sort of meditation. And I've put here that he goes from renunciation to affirmation. What he begins to do is to think this idea of dwelling. What does it mean to dwell in the landscape? What does it mean to dwell? This is one of the surviving gardens. And later, what does it mean to, and what does it mean to build into the, how do you build in the landscape in such a way that you don't destroy the landscape? How do you move from negation to affirmation? How do you create